Hello and welcome to today's presentation, The Bugs That Bug You, brought to you by Plymouth County Extension. Today's presentation is going to review tick and mosquito-borne diseases, and especially we're going to go over ways that you can prevent ticks and mosquitoes from biting you and potentially transmitting diseases that may cause you sickness. My name is Blake Dinius, and I work as the entomologist educator for Plymouth County Extension. This is me right here. I'm at the top of Mount Washington, and it's not just to boast, but what I really like to get across to people is that I do spend a lot of time outdoors, and I have never once gotten a tick or mosquito-borne disease, despite the fact that I'm spending so much time outside. And I promise you that I do not have my car just parked outside the view of this photo, that I did indeed walk up there the entire way. And you can see what I have on me. I've got my binoculars, so I do spend a lot of time birding, hiking, camping, fishing, backpacking. I really like to get out there. Before I got this job, I spent about 7 years in insect research, primarily working with honeybees. And these are some examples of what we would do. We would take a grafting tool and we would graft these larval bees outside of a frame and we would grow them to adulthood. But in my current capacity, I work as an educator, which means that I'm no longer conducting research of my own, but I do read a lot of research. And I take that information and I break it down and I give you science-based knowledge, evidence-based information that you can put into practice. And I go into a variety of different locations such as schools, libraries, and even outside to people's backyards. But you can really just think of me as a giant bug nerd. I've really enjoyed bugs my entire life, the good and the bad, and it's my pleasure to discuss to you some of the ways that you can protect yourself from some of the bad bugs. So why are we concerned about ticks and mosquitoes? Well, the reason is because they blood feed on us and they have the potential to transmit disease. But ticks and mosquitoes are not necessarily new. They weren't cooked up in a government lab in the last 100 years. We estimate that ticks are about 400 million years old and the mosquitoes are about 70 to 230 million years old. So I have this image of this Tyrannosaurus Rex. Could you imagine the ticks are older than Tyrannosaurus Rex and that T-Rex may have needed to do tick checks at some point in its life. The way that mosquitoes feed is very different from ticks. Mosquitoes are actually looking to cannulate blood vessels, and they're very quick feeders. You can see from this image that the mosquito is probing, looking for a small blood vessel, as you're going to drink directly from that. With mosquitoes, it's only the females and only the adult females that feed on blood. The males actually feed on nectar, and it's because the females are involved in egg production and they need the additional nutrients that they obtain from blood to fuel egg production. Ticks, on the other hand, are a lot different from mosquitoes. They are long-term feeders, and they don't necessarily look to cannulate a blood vessel. Ticks also only feed on blood, and they feed on nothing else. What's also very shocking about the way in which ticks feed is that they only feed 3 times over the course of about 2 years, which means that they need to obtain all the nutrients that they need for everything from growth, development, and reproduction from just 3 blood meals alone. So in order to feed for such a long time, it means that ticks are the masters of stealth when they feed. And they don't, like I mentioned earlier, they're not looking to cannulate a blood vessel. What they're doing as they feed is they're creating these things called feeding lesions. And you can think of a feeding lesion as maybe a little bit like a pool of blood underneath your skin. And this tick is going to inject a number of pharmacologically active agents into your blood through its saliva in order to simulate this feeding lesion. These are going to include anticoagulants, vasodilators to promote blood flow to the site, things that that impede platelet formation, and things that are going to knock out our immune system. So it very often comes as a shock to people when they have had a tick feeding on them for about 4 to 7 days, and they never even noticed that tick was there. And this is really the way in which ticks feed. They've developed this over the course of 400 million years. And yeah, I know it sounds pretty disgusting, but in addition to this, the blood feeding, this is the mechanism in which mosquitoes and ticks are able to transmit infection. And infection can possibly lead to disease. When it comes to tick and mosquito-borne diseases, there have been more discoveries over the course of history. And if we focus on just the tick-borne pathogens in the past 120 years, what we see from this diagram is that there are many more discoveries in the past 40 years. And you can see right here, you've got Heartland virus, Rickettsia philippi, Ehrlichia mers occlurensis, Borrelia miyamotoi, Borrelia miyoni. It just is very shocking the number of diseases that have come up. And this can be very surprising to people and can kind of take people back. So we're going to talk a little bit about what might be going on and why we might be seeing these kinds of trends. In addition to this, if we just focus on Lyme disease, we can see that not only are there more pathogens, but these pathogens have started to become more common in people. So this this map shows a diagram of the United States in 2001, and each blue dot represents a case of Lyme disease. If we fast forward to 2015, 14 years later, we can see just how much that has fanned out from that location. And if we want to focus on Massachusetts, Massachusetts looks like someone took just a blue crayon and colored it in. We're right at the heart of all of it. So are things getting worse? You hear all the time in the news, doesn't matter which paper you follow or which media outlet source is your preference, they all kind of show the same thing, this shocking values of what's going on. Things are so bad. We've got triple E going on, Lyme disease, all these different cases. There was this report released by the CDC a couple years back, and they said that tick and mosquito-borne diseases have tripled in the United States in 2004. So what is going on? Is there any truth to that? Well, ticks and mosquitoes weren't necessarily always the bad guys. And it wasn't always this way. If you look back through history, back to hunter-gatherer society, you might think that people living in and amongst these animals kind of, gathering their food from the woods where they didn't really have these houses to protect them. They didn't necessarily have the clothing that we wear. What we find is that they suffer from relatively fewer pathogens than we suffer from today. And we think it has to, the onset of agrarian and agricultural living is kind of what facilitated this increase in tick and mosquito-borne diseases about 40,000 years ago. Because with that type of living, the agrarian and agricultural living, we found the destruction of wild hosts. We were killing things that these ticks and mosquitoes were preferentially feeding on. Destruction of wild habitat. We were moving into areas that these ticks and mosquitoes lived. Community living was also very important because there are some diseases, especially ones that are caused by viruses, that confer a very long immunity. And if you have a lot of people living in a community, well, then that virus can spread from one person to the next. But if these people are spread very far apart, that virus may not have the potential of sustaining itself in the environment. We also think that the domestication of animals about 14,000 years ago was very important to why people are suffering from tick and mosquito-borne diseases as well. So with all these factors, what we ended up seeing was that the vectors, so that's another word for a tick and mosquito, something that transmits a disease, we found that these vectors adapted to new food, which is us, and with them, they brought diseases. Because the reason we think this is because a lot of diseases are what we call zoonoses or animal diseases. They circulate in wild animal hosts, and they do so with very little impact on these animals. So for instance, Lyme disease circulates in white-footed mice and other small rodents, and even some birds. But Lyme disease doesn't really impact white-footed mice all that severely. It just goes into the mice, and the mice express a very low reaction to it, and they accumulate many bacteria inside their bodies and spread it to other ticks. And they don't suffer from Lyme disease in the same way that humans do. Triple E and West Nile virus circulate in birds. Now there are some birds that do suffer very severely from these viruses, but many of them, it's not nearly as severe as it is for human beings. We also think that living close to animals has increased our risk of contracting some of these diseases as well. When we build our neighborhoods into these forests, we change the ecology around. It brings us in close contact with these animals. If a tick is feeding on a mouse and we're living in these habitats that frequently have mice and deer, then we may be in closer contact with ticks, for instance. And we also think that the expansion or the reemergence of certain hosts like deer, which were almost extinct, has also triggered an increase in the number of diseases that we see today. And when it comes to mosquitoes, there are certain mosquitoes that live in and around human habitats, and some of them even depend on degraded habitat. For instance, this mosquito here, the northern house mosquito, that really likes nasty, murky, mucky water. So some of the water that you might see like at the bottom of a tire or inside maybe this drainage ditch, that mosquito really likes that kind of water. And so the more of that you have around, the more of these mosquitoes you may see. We also think that one of the reasons why we're seeing more types of diseases and possibly more cases of diseases is that just science has improved overall. We have a better understanding of infection and disease. We have better diagnostic techniques so that we can find these diseases and find and diagnose people when they actually have them. When Lyme disease was first discovered back in the 1980s, we used to think that it was juvenile rheumatoid arthritis. It went under a completely different name. It wasn't until we kind of put two and two together that we actually developed a name for this disease. It was caused by a bacteria. And so once people knew that it was caused by the bacteria and they knew that this thing existed, then they were able to diagnose it in other people. We also have a heightened awareness of what's going on. And so that's also going to cause an increase in the number of cases. Another interesting thing that plays a role, if we fast forward to the map of 2018, this is a similar map put together by the CDC, where each blue dot represents a case of Lyme disease. If you look at Massachusetts, it looks like there are maybe 3 or 4 cases in the entire state. So why did Massachusetts go from almost being completely colored in by a blue crayon to now it looks like almost nothing is there? Well, I'll give you a hint. I started in 2017. And while I'd like to believe that, it's not necessarily me that caused it. I'm not like St. Patrick that drove the snakes out. It actually has a lot to do with the way that tick and mosquito-borne diseases are reported. In 2016, the Massachusetts Department of Public Health stopped requiring case follow-up for Lyme disease. And this is my basic understanding of it. And why is that? Why did they stop doing that? Well, it's because filling out case reports is very time-consuming. And what they determined is that Lyme disease is going to be high for the foreseeable future. So what they decided is that instead of devoting time and resources to recording the numbers of cases of tick-borne disease, like to the actual specific case, they thought that those resources would be better allocated towards tick bite prevention. And I tend to agree with that. But if you look, Massachusetts Department of Public Health still records tick bite exposure visits, and you can see from this map that things really haven't changed. What they list on their site is about 7.5 to 15 cases per 10,000 people. And if you compare that to the way that the CDC reports things, which the CDC reports things as per 100,000 people, you can see that the numbers haven't really changed too much since 2016, and that we're getting about 75 to 150 cases per 100,000 people, which is about on par for what it was in 2016, which was about 100-ish. So what are some things that we can do to prevent all this from going on? Well, a very interesting interaction that ticks, humans, and mosquitoes in the pathogens that they carry play. If we want to look at the relationships between all of those different things, we can set up this diagram here that I have on the right. And you can think of it a little bit like a chair that has 3 legs. If you were to knock out any one of those legs, that chair is going to fall over. So if we attack any one of these relationships from different angles, we can kind of knock out the chance that humans are going to suffer from an infection. For instance, if we focus on the vector, so the tick or mosquito, and the pathogen, in the case of ticks, it might be Lyme disease. In the case of mosquitoes, it might be EEE. If we knock out that relationship, then these vectors might not necessarily pick up those germs, and it doesn't matter if they're flying around, they're not going to make us sick. And so this is one way that we can kind of focus on this. In some ways, it can be controlling animal populations. For instance, if we were to control white-footed mice, we may prevent ticks from picking up the Lyme disease bacteria. If we focus on the pathogen and host relationship, so whether or not these germs can even get into us and make us sick, Like if you think about a vaccine, for instance, there could be many, many infected mosquitoes flying out and around. But if we have a vaccine that prevents us from getting triple E, we don't need to worry as much about the mosquitoes potentially passing on triple E to us. But what I really want to talk to you about is this last relationship. And this is the relationship that humans have with ticks and mosquitoes directly. Because this is the relationship that we have the most control over. We can't necessarily do too much to control whether or not ticks and mosquitoes pick up those germs. And we can't necessarily go out tomorrow and invent a vaccine for these. But what we can do is decide whether or not we want to apply repellents to our bodies, wear protective clothing, and prevent those ticks and mosquitoes from biting us directly. So this is the question I want to ask you. What are you doing to protect yourself? I'm someone who likes to spend a lot of time outdoors. I like camping, I like hiking. If you look at where I am in all these photos, you can see that I'm really out there in the thick of it. All surrounding me is tick habitat. You've got all this nice, tall, brushy vegetation. And when I go out camping, there are mosquitoes flying all around me. But I've never once had a tick-borne disease. And since I've been practicing the things that we're about to go over, I have never once been bit by a tick. And I still do tick checks every single day. I also have never had a mosquito-borne disease either. So let's start our discussion with talking about where you might find these organisms and what these organisms depend on in nature. So you can think about ticks as basically soil-dwelling organisms. Do you know if you lift a log, you see those roly-polies that scurry around? Those, you can kind of think of ticks in a very similar way as you think of those roly-polies. They really want to stay close to the ground where the humidity is very high. They want to be tucked away underneath vegetation where they are spending most of their time. We find that on average, only about 6.3 of the entire tick population is active at any given moment. So sometimes people will come up to me and they'll say, I walked through my yard and I picked up 10 ticks. To me, that's not all that surprising. The most number of ticks that I've gone out when I've done surveillance work and collected was 100 ticks in about 30 minutes. And I collected those on a flag or a sweep. So it's not all that surprising when people find 10 ticks, because we know that this number is going to fluctuate a lot from day to day. But the rule of thumb is that you're going to find ticks in areas that maintain high levels of humidity. You can think about mosquitoes as basically aquatic organisms. So even though we see them flying around our heads a lot, this is the life stage that we think of mosquitoes the most often as these flying, buzzing critters. They spend most of their life in and around water. When it comes to controlling ticks around your yard, one of the most important things you can do is maintain a well-manicured lawn. If you look at this photo on the right, this is a very hostile environment for ticks. It gets a lot of sun, it gets a lot of wind exposure. There's not all that much vegetation for the ticks to hide underneath. And what we find, especially this time of year, that if you rake leaves, you can reduce ticks up to 75 to 77% the following year. So raking leaves right now is going to help reduce ticks that you might see in the spring. But I want to give you a word of caution about raking leaves and doing yard work. The first thing is that if you do rake leaves, you don't want to pile them up in and around the edge of your property. Because what that does is it basically creates this high risk zone wherever you've piled up the leaves. And if you're piling up along the edge and you have children or dogs that cross that barrier, now they've crossed this high risk zone, so you haven't done too much to mitigate your risk. If you do decide to rake leaves now, what you would want to do is compost them or burn them or otherwise remove them from an area that you're going to see high traffic. The other thing about raking leaves and doing yard work this time of year is that as you are doing that, your risk of encountering a tick is much higher. So you always want to wear proper protection when you're doing yard work. So even though you are overall reducing the chance of encountering a tick in your yard, at that given moment, your risk is higher. When it comes to mosquitoes, again, we think of them more like aquatic organisms. A lot of times people will come to me and they think that this pond, for instance, this pond near their house is the primary source of where the mosquitoes are coming from. But mosquitoes only fly for about 2 kilometers or less. That's about 1.25 miles or less. So they don't fly very far from the water source from which they're born. And this is most mosquitoes. Not all mosquitoes are like that. In general, the mosquitoes that you're seeing in and around your property are coming from very close by. When I look at this house, for instance, these are all the different locations that I can pick that I would imagine mosquitoes are breeding in and around this house. Things like potted plants, gutters, buckets, like empty pots. All these things can be potential mosquito breeding habitats, not necessarily the pond down the street. The other thing I wanted to mention about that pond is that there are a lot of things in that pond, such as fish, dragonfly larvae, damselfly larvae, that are going to be eating mosquito larvae. When you have mosquitoes breeding in your gutters, there are no fish that are going to be eating those mosquito larvae. So the big rule of thumb is that mosquitoes really cannot live without water. So going in and around your house, you're going to want to look for these types of locations: bird baths, potted plants, gutters. And on the bottom right, especially, there are these corrugated gutter drains. And if you can think of each one of these little ridges as holding a little bit of water, mosquitoes can breed in a bottle cap's worth of water. So each one of these little ridges could potentially be a mosquito breeding habitat. But mosquitoes need still water, water that's not moving. So if you can keep the water moving either through a pump in your bird bath or changing it every week, or replacing those corrugated gutters with something similar to the photo on the left, that's going to reduce the number of mosquitoes you see around your yard. What about yard sprays? Do they work? This is one of the most common questions I get on a daily basis. You've got all these different companies that are trying to market these types of sprays to you through the use of fear and this bombarding you with flyers that come in the mail. So let's talk a little about sprays. And I know that this is a little bit of a contentious topic and that there are some people that will choose not to use them, and there are some people that will. But what I want you to think about sprays as is really more or less just a tool in the toolbox, and that if you don't use them, you just have to understand that you're going to have to rely on other protective measures in place of these yard sprays. So with tick yard sprays, if you're just focusing on controlling ticks in and around your property, they can actually be very effective, but you have to do them the right way, and you have to do them at the right time. The photos on the bottom demonstrate that about 82% of ticks are found less than 10 feet from the forest edge. So that means that if you're spraying your yard for ticks, or you're having someone spray your yard for ticks, this is the high risk zone that you're going to be encountering ticks, is that 10 feet from the forest edge. When you do engage in a tick yard spray, you want to use a synthetic compound, a pyrethroid. This is one that's going to be EPA registered for the control of ticks. And it's important to use a synthetic because the all-natural sprays, at least from the scientific data, have not been shown to do much more than just straight water. They just have not gotten there yet. So I would say that if you don't want to use any synthetic chemicals, I would say just don't do a yard spray at all and rely on some other protective measures in place of it. But if you don't have an issue with synthetic compounds, make sure you're using a pyrethroid labeled for protection against ticks. Timing is really important. You want to have the yard spray conducted in early May and early June. That's because the life stage called the nymph life stage of ticks is active at this time. If you were to spray during July, August, or even this time of year, you're not going to see nearly as much of an impact as if you were to spray just in May and just in June. And that's all you would need to do. So if you have someone spraying more than 2 times a year, they're either spraying at the wrong time or they're spraying too much. And if you repeat this spray yearly, you're going to see substantial suppression of ticks in and around your property. You can do this by hiring someone, or you can do it yourself. If you do it yourself, you want to look, and you can find these at garden centers, in Home Depot or Lowe's. You want to look for something that's EPA registered. You want to find something that's made for use on lawns and gardens. And you want to make sure that it lists that it will control deer ticks or ticks in general. And I would recommend that you get one of these things that says ready to use or ready to spray. That's the images on the bottom. Now these products just hook up to your garden hose. They're very easy to use. There's no mixing involved. And you would just spray that 10-foot barrier around the perimeter of your property. It's really important when using any of these products that you follow the label. It's actually a federal offense if you do not use these products according to the label. So for instance, on the photo on the left, you can see this woman and she's actually spraying flowers. That's actually illegal for her to do that. You can see the photo on the right where this man is just spraying the ground. You don't need to spray very high up. You're just looking to spray the ground to protect against ticks. But once again, follow the label. Now, what about mosquito yard sprays? Mosquito yard sprays are a little bit different. They're all very variable and very temporary. And so what I would recommend in terms of getting a mosquito spray done is that you contact your local mosquito control project, and they will come out and spray your yard free by trained professionals. What else can you do beyond just yard sprays and managing your property? Well, you can limit your chance of being exposed to mosquitoes, for instance, by limiting your activity to the daytime. What we find is that there are more night and twilight biting mosquitoes that are carrying germs than there are daytime biting mosquitoes. And there are mosquitoes that do bite during the day. For instance, if pulling up some data from 2019, out of the 428 positive pools, the mosquito, basically the pools that were tested positive for EEE, there were 428 of them in 2019. 34 of those pools were day biting mosquitoes and 394 were night and twilight biting mosquitoes. So you think you can kind of hedge your bets towards these day biting mosquitoes, which are much less likely to carry these pathogens than the night and twilight biting mosquitoes. But as a side note, trapping methods and timing can skew these results. So it's not hard and fast. You can wear personal protection. You can wear these really nerdy kind of fashion statements, like tucking your pants into your socks to prevent ticks from crawling up and under your pant cuff. And trust me, you do not want ticks crawling up and under your pant cuff, because sometimes ticks can take a couple of hours to bite, and they may crawl all the way up your leg, all the way to places that only your doctor should have access to. And you can also wear these head nets that protect you from mosquitoes that might want to bite you. But covering up only gets you so far. What if there was more you could do? No one wants to walk through the woods and come out after a nice sunny day, walking through the woods, relaxing, and end up with ticks covering their pant leg, like in this photo. This is where repellents come into play. But there are so many different kinds of repellents. What should you use? I'd recommend that you look very closely at the bottle and try to look beyond just the label, the words that stand out. You want to look for the active ingredient. When I look at this green bottle, really the active ingredient is the only important thing in my opinion, right down here. So the active ingredients you want to look for are DEET, picaridin or icaridin, IR3535, oil of lemon eucalyptus, or 2-undecanone. And these are all as long as these products come in an EPA registered product, you're good to go. A word about DEET. A lot of people are afraid of DEET, but it's not DDT. It's not the same. Now, this product is the most common and it's the most readily available and the most widely used. It's been around for about 60 years. And during that time, we estimate that about 700 million people use DEET annually. And the World Health Organization estimated as of 1998, 22 years ago, that there were 8 billion human applications that had happened. And during that time, only 4 deaths have ever been associated with DEET, and they were never ever confirmed. And so you think about that, the risk of using this product is very, very low. And I'd like to add on top of that, that 1 million people die per year from mosquito bites, and there are an estimated 300,000 US cases of Lyme disease per year, and falling coconuts kill 150 people per year. So when you think about this, over the 4 deaths over the course of 60 years, over 8 billion human applications, DEET is relatively squeaky clean, safe to use. But I know a lot of people still will refuse not to use it. And so we do have other options like picaridin, like IR3535, like oil of lemon eucalyptus, and like 2-undecanone. This is another product that I'd like to talk about, and this one is called permethrin. This product does not necessarily work very good against mosquitoes, but it works very, very well against ticks. This is a short video that I want to show you where a tick was crawling on my pant leg, and these pants have been treated with this product called permethrin. Now you can see this tick crawling around on my legs, and it's going to engage in a behavior that we call hot foot behavior, where it's going to lift up its front legs. See right there. And then it falls off. And now that tick is dead. So that tick, just by the nature of crawling over my pants that had been treated with this product, it killed that tick. And so I feel very comfortable walking through the woods wearing permethrin on these clothes and knowing that any ticks that come in contact with me are not going to live long enough to bite. Where do you get permethrin? Well, it's sold in garden centers, big box stores like Walmart and Target, Amazon, or you can get pre-treated clothing through this company called insectshield.com. And I believe they also sell their clothing through LL Bean and REI. So you can get this access through a number of different ways. And it's a little bit different than repellents. You apply it differently and it works differently. First off, you only apply it to clothing and shoes, never skin. It's not going to work properly on skin and you just don't want to expose yourself to it. You need to apply it in advance and wait for it to dry. This is something that you cannot wear wet. It's just not going to work that well. But unlike DEET and all these other repellents, it lasts through 6 washings or 1 month. It lasts for a very, very long time. It binds very, very tightly to fabric. And that's what makes it so effective. But a note of caution is that you want to keep cats away until it's dry. Cats are very sensitive to plant toxins, and permethrin is modeled after a plant toxin. But once it's dry, it's okay. This is my cat, and she's sitting on my lap, and my pants were treated with permethrin, but my pants were dry, so it was fine. And I've spoken with a number of veterinarians, and they also agree that once the product is dry, it's fine. What about all natural products? And I do want to cover this a little bit. This is what we call 25B exempt products. And so these products, if they're all natural, the EPA has decided that they do not need any measure of safety or efficacy in order to be sold. So what that means is that I could buy a bottle of lemonade, market it as a bug repellent, and sell it to you, and there's nothing illegal about that. So you don't know exactly what you're getting if you're getting something that is very ineffective or something that may be helpful. What we do know from the scientific literature is that these all natural repellents suffer from a few different things, and even in the ones that do work, they either don't last as long or they don't provide as much repellency. But I do know that there are a group of people out there that are going to wear all natural or nothing else. And I would rather you use something rather than nothing. The other thing I'd like to bring up with these all naturals is that we don't know their health effects. Some of them contain known allergens. And while some of these products that they use, like a combination of different essential oils, some of these essential oils are known to be safe, but we don't necessarily know what happens when you mix them all together. Next, I want to talk to you about protecting our pets, especially dogs, because dogs like to do this. They like to go outside and roll around in leaves, and then they like to do this. They like to lay in all the different spots in and around our house. And like I mentioned earlier, ticks don't necessarily bite the first place they see. Sometimes it can take hours for a tick to bite. And sometimes they may not even bite the first animal they come across. So if this dog was rolling around in leaves that might be there where there might be ticks inside, picked up a few ticks, then sat in a bed, that tick may crawl off onto the bed. And so in some ways, our pets can act a little bit like Trojan horses. So in addition to protecting our pets because we love them, we also want to protect ourselves because our animals can bring in ticks into our homes. So the thing that I want to really recommend when it comes to using treatments for cats and dogs is once again following the label. Even though the packaging looks the same on both these things, and you might even confuse the small dog to be a small cat, if you were to apply this product made for a small dog on a cat, you would do some serious damage. You may even kill that cat. The other thing that I'd like to mention about using a tick and flea preventative is that you want to get something that has a good knockdown effect. Because because ticks don't necessarily always attach the first place they see, you want to make sure that that product is going to be knocking down and killing any ticks, whether or not they are feeding on that animal. There are some products like these oral medications like Brevecto and NexGard that don't necessarily work until the tick begins to feed. And in that case, if you're only treating with those products, that dog may bring in a tick into your house and once again drop it off inside your home. Lastly, when it comes to protecting ourselves, I want to talk about tick checks, because there's really no way that you can avoid tick checks. And there's no way, I mean, when it comes to mosquitoes, like we mentioned, they're short-term feeders, but ticks are long-term feeders. And if you get off the tick early enough, you can help reduce the chance of getting sick. And here are some fun statistics to really kind of horrify you. In this one study, they found that 90% of people did not remove the nymphal tick in less than 24 hours. So 9 out of 10 people didn't actually find this nymphal tick on them in less than 24 hours. And in the second study, what they found is that 81% of people who had Lyme disease do not even remember being bit by the tick. Once again, ticks are masters of stealth. They're looking to bite you in locations that you don't readily see and feed for a long time and make sure you don't feel them as long as they are feeding. If you do find a tick, how do you remove it? Step 1, don't overcomplicate things. This is an example of a life hack where a guy attempted to repair a sink with a bit of ramen noodles. When it comes to removing ticks, grab a pair of tweezers, firmly grasp it, and pull straight up. If you're bitten by either ticks or mosquitoes, it's really important that you don't Google your symptoms. The symptoms for a lot of these diseases, from Triple E to West Nile virus to Lyme disease to anaplasmosis, babesiosis, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, they're all very generalized. And especially living in the era of COVID, we find that there's many overlaps between many different diseases. The top shows an example of symptoms taken from the CDC of COVID symptoms, and the bottom shows an example of symptoms that you may experience if you have Lyme disease. And these are all the different symptoms and where they overlap. So it's important that if you're ever bitten, you gather evidence. So were you bitten? Okay, when? If you do have that tick, you can't really do this for mosquitoes because they're so quick, but if you do have that tick, you can save that tick and you can bag it and write the date that you were bitten. This is really important because we know that the onset of symptoms occurs a certain amount of time after the bite. What species? You can have that tick identified if you save it. And we know that there are certain diseases that are specific to certain kinds of ticks. The green represents diseases that only deer ticks can carry. The blue and the purple represents diseases that Lone Star tick carries. And the purple represents diseases that only the American dog tick can carry. And you can actually test the tick as well. In this particular report here, done through UMass Amherst's tick report, what you find is that the tick came back positive for 2 different pathogens. One pathogen that causes Lyme disease and another pathogen that causes babesiosis. What's significant about this is that these 2 diseases, should they develop, are treated with different medications. You also want to photograph any rashes or bites that develop. And the bottom left photo is an example of the bullseye rash that is characteristic of Lyme disease. The bottom right photo also shows the bullseye rash that is characteristic of Lyme disease. So it's important that you gather hard photographic evidence that you can bring to your doctor or bring to another doctor and keep that with you at all times. So the bottom line is that with the right knowledge and awareness, vector-borne diseases are preventable. And at this point, I'm happy to entertain any questions. If you have them, you can feel free to email me. My information is at the top here. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you.